Welcome all. My name is Alex Nelson. My pronouns are they, them, theirs, and I am glad to be joining today as the Community Engagement and Research Specialist for the National Right to Housing Network. I'll be your moderator today for Public Money for Public Good. Welcome. I want to reflect for a moment on my relationship to the land that I'm joining from, and I encourage those attending to also acknowledge this in the chat. I am joining today from the ancestral territories of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenape-Wauk, and Chinantan nations on land colonially known as London, Ontario. I am a white settler and I'm an uninvited guest on these lands. I speak also from a place of my own lived experience of homelessness at the intersection of queerness and disability, and my journey with unsafe housing against the backdrop of an escalating affordability crisis. Our relationships to land, our histories, our experiences shape our work, and we want to honor those ties and acknowledge how we come into this space and our shared spaces as people who hold different kinds of identities and on whose work our work is tied to dismantling the same systems that are built on the ongoing colonization of Indigenous territories. At the National Right to Housing Network, we try and ground our spaces to orient ourselves and our words into justice, equity, and dignity, and holding those in power accountable to realize our rights. We are here today on National Housing Day to amplify the need for rights-based structures, approaches, and policies. This is against the backdrop of the Fall Economic Statement, which came out yesterday, which demonstrates that we are not set up for success in the current system. I'm sure some of our speakers will speak further to this topic. This session will be recorded for accurate note-taking purposes. It will be bilingual, accessible, and will remain respectful of all at all times. To access the English and French audio channels at any point, please click on the globe icon at the bottom of your Zoom window and select the best audio for you. For anyone requiring sign language support, please note that ASL and LSQ interpreters are present, as you can see on your screen, and will be spotlit throughout the session. For anyone requiring closed captions, please note that English captions are embedded into the Zoom session and can be accessed through the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. For the French captions, please follow the link posted in the chat, which will open another window in your browser that will display the live French captions. If you experience any issues with these functions, please reach out through the chat function to the OFHA tech team. We also ask that you read our respectful space agreement that will be linked in the chat. We are creating a safe space for all participants in the session today, and to that end, we will employ a zero tolerance policy regarding any behavior in the chat that could be construed as harassment or disrespect to any persons or groups, or general bullying or mistreatment of any kind. Anyone displaying such behavior will be removed for the sake of maintaining the safety of others present. Thank you. Today, we will hear from several presenters, including Marie-Josée Houle, Canada's first federal housing advocate, Dr. Carolyn Witzman, a housing rights advocate, researcher, and adjunct professor in the Department of Geography, Environment, and Geomatics, the University of Ottawa. A note that Dr. Witzman's report was commissioned by the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate and will be posted in the chat as well. Olga Taski, CEO, Agency of Cooperative Housing. Margaret Faux, CEO of the Aboriginal Housing Management Association, and Stéphane Corriveau, founder and executive director of the Community Housing Transformation Center. Bios for all our presenters today will also be posted in the chat. And a few just additional notes for today's session. As we noted, we want to encourage respectful participation in the chat, and we are posting some guidelines for inclusive participation for your reference. Since we only have 1.5 hours today, we will endeavor to capture as much of your substantive comments as possible for the What We Heard report that will be published on the Advocate's website in December. A link to that website will also be posted in the chat for you. And I would like to now turn over the session, it is my honor to do so, to Elder Sequalia to open the session in a good way. Elder Sequalia and Wannock is a knowledge carrier and elder advisor from Squamish Nation with strong Indigenous worldviews, ancestral knowledge, and traditional teachings. Elder Sequoia, please.
Kayachtan. I'm going to be speaking in my own language just for a few words. Kayachtan. On Hoth and Squalwin, Quisclake, Quichnomi, Tenoyup, and NCI to Squals to Seats. I shared with you, welcome. I'm really glad that you all made it here today, all of you, my friends. And I acknowledge, respect, and honor the ancestral traditional territory of Squamish Nation, my land where you're coming into on my device, and acknowledge, respect, and honor all the ancestral traditional territories where you live, work, and play, and where any Indigenous, First Nation, Inuit, Métis members here today, where you're from and your ancestral territories. I'm Sequoia Quashaman Sna. My ancestral name is Sequoia. My everyday name is Anwanik. And I'm here in BC, and it's an honor to start you off on a very important topic to many people, especially to those who are homeless, as well as to those who are receiving housing from all the many organizations. I'm going to ask you all to come together with one heart and one mind, and to be able to chin stwipe, stand and work together to hold each other up and support one another with and I usually share that I'm a Star Wars person because my grandfather taught me every human being, our teaching is every human being has the inner energy that connects all of us, and everything in creation, in the air, the stars, the moon, the sun, and everything that flies, and all of the things on Mother Earth, the trees, medicine plants and animals, from four-legged to everything on earth and everything in water, and that we can send our energy to each other through prayer or thoughts. And so it was a connection for me when I saw the first Star Wars, that the forces, the inner energy my grandfather talked about. And so I ask you to open your hands, open them on your lap, your armchairs or desk, and breathe. Our people believe in breathing is important to ground us. And take a few breaths and ground yourself. I'm just going to do a short part of Sequoia, my namesake, my ancestor Sequoia's song, Greeting of the Day, and then do a prayer to start you into your gathering. And then I'll be leaving as I have other commitments that I have to go to. So let's have one heart and one mind, pray for each other, pray for all the presenters, and pray for all our family, friends, and communities. Hoichaka. Chen Quen Mentomi Kakakanak Chasiam Yonsion so Tinoyap and Manman Squalwin to Squales to Seats Yonsio Manman Equadal Chet Yap Squalwin Okameo Chet Yap Squalwin Siayat Chet Yap Squalwin to Squales to Seats. Asking you, Creator, to watch over all your children gathered here today and all of their family, Equadal Chet, all of their villages where they're originally from, Okameokchet, and where they live, work, and play now, and all of their friends. asking you to help them all with their squalwant feelings in their hearts and minds, their emotional, mental, physical, and spiritual health and wellness, and put a shield of safety and protection around each and every one of them. Asking you, Creator and ancestors, to help all of your children gathered here today to be able to come together in Chomo, Squalwant, with one heart and one mind, and to be able to share their words, the snachum, the words that they speak, and listen to Quianitum with Winoxus, respect, and take into their hearts what's meant for them, set aside what they don't need today to bring back another day when they need it. And for all of them who are knowledge carriers in their own right, to be able to transfer knowledge, information, and experience, and be able to create positive plans for the present and future, always thinking of those coming behind us who are unborn yet, and thinking of the 7 generations ahead. Asking you, Creator, to let them create positive plans for housing for all the people who need it, and to be able to create safe homes for everyone when they do their work that they do. Asking you, Creator, to let today be a Yetwan Haltzates off, an excellent work today, and that they have a wonderful gathering, and that they all return home safely if they have to be moving to from where they are now to where go home. And to ask you, Creator, to just watch over them and let them keep doing the great work that they do and to continue to do. Tama Quetzi Snachum. Those are my words. And I say, Chen Quen Mentomiap, I'm grateful and thankful to all of you for allowing me to join you and open the gathering today. And as I always say, from my late son I lost in 2018, he'd always say peace and love. And he put his peace sign over his heart, because that's peace and love, top left. And I've added peace of heart and mind, love from my heart to your heart, air hugs. Wachayap yo, you all take care. Now I'll turn it back over to Alex or whoever is chairing before I leave.
Thank you so much, Elder Sequoia. I'm definitely going to be sitting with your words, especially about sharing our energies with one another for this important topic and finding meaning in unconventional places to guide us to do good work for the present and the future. Thank you. Thank you so much. I hope that we can ground our discussion in what you've shared with us today.
Oh, Chen Quinman told me I'm grateful and thankful to you, and I'm going to leave now.
All right. Thank you so much.
Yo, you all take care and have a great day.
Thank you. I now have the pleasure of introducing Marie-Josée Houle, our federal housing advocate and an incredible champion for the human right to housing, who will be setting some of the context for today's discussion on public money for public good. Welcome, Marie-Josée.
Well, thank you so much, Alex, and a sincere thank you to Elder Sequoia for opening today's discussion in a good way. Before we get to our speaker and panelists, I'd like to make some contextual remarks. We're all witness to the growing housing inequities in our country, and some are reaping financial benefits from the commodification of housing, while others are being left behind. And last year, we received submissions from right holders about the systemic housing issues that they have experienced. Unaffordable housing was cited as an issue in 77% of submissions, and 61% reported difficulty finding housing. Many reported having to forego basic needs in order to pay rent, and more than half of submissions were from households with a family member that identifies as a person with a disability. So it's not the individual failings that leave people precariously or unhoused, but systemic issues, including colonial policies like the 60s scoop residential schools and today's child welfare system that continues to remove children from their communities, the discrimination in rental housing based on indigeneity, racism, gender, age, and other factors, lagging incomes, housing being a vehicle for wealth accumulation rather than a place to live and to build community, and other factors. So we must act now to create a human rights-based solutions that mobilize resources and prioritize low-income, disadvantaged groups like seniors, people with disabilities, women and gender diverse people, refugees, and Indigenous people, so that everyone can enjoy their human right to adequate housing. Our political leaders are verbalizing that there is a housing crisis in Canada, but bold policy and budget measures that also include actions to address homelessness remain limited and without the needed long-term vision and leadership. And last year on the National Right to Housing Day, I called on the federal government to take steps to align the National Housing Strategy with the human rights obligations outlined in the National Housing Strategy Act. Well, today, I want to do a deeper dive on one of those steps. And as I call on the federal government to prioritize the development and acquisition of non-market housing supply that is permanently affordable and provides community value, it's really important that they get it right. So by non-market or community housing, as it may be called, I'm referring to nonprofit housing, government-owned housing, co-op housing, community land trusts, and Indigenous-led non-market housing. So in a few days, on November 27th, our partners at the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association and Housing Partnership Canada will release a study quantifying the relationship between community housing and the strength of the Canadian economy. And this study will demonstrate how public investment in non-market housing not only protects housing as a social good for communities, but that it's also an economic necessity and serves to strengthen our economy. Speaking of the economy, yesterday, the Fall Economic Statement was released reporting on the state of the Canadian economy and making some federal funding announcements. Most relevant to the non-market housing sector, the following announcements were made. So $309 million in new funding for the Cooperative Development Program. So this is the only spending on non-market housing in the statement. And then it also includes the removal of the GST on development of new co-op rentals. It also announced $1 billion for the Affordable Housing Fund for 7,000 homes across the country over 3 years, of which only 370 million is actually new spending, because 631 million is just reallocated from the Canada Housing Benefit Plan top up. And then they also announced a new minimum affordable housing target of 20% for projects under the Canada Lands Company. And no new funding was announced for the urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing strategy beyond the $4 billion included in the 2023 budget. In 2018, however, the federal and provincial governments made a commitment to prioritize, protect, and grow the non-market housing sector under the Multilateral Partnership Framework Agreement. And while yesterday's announcements, they are welcome, it doesn't come close to addressing the need. There is so much more to do to strengthen and invest in the non-market housing sector and shift our perceptions around it as a viable long-term option for many more people, including those who need housing the most. In Canada, non-market housing represents just 3.5% of the country's total housing stocks. That's 655,000 homes. And this amount is lacking substantially behind other OECD or OECD countries, such as the Netherlands, who sit at close to 35%. In Austria and Denmark, they sit at more than 20%. And even the UK is at more than 15%. So we're told that non-market housing is expensive and that governments don't have the capital. So I want to explore with our speakers today, using the National Housing Strategy and other assets and investments, what mechanisms can we leverage to obtain capital for the creation of more non-market housing, and how can we ensure the sector is set up for success? The National Housing Strategy represents an $82 billion investment in ending inadequate housing and homelessness. And a report by the National Housing Council found that fewer than 5% of the units built by the strategy so far would be affordable to those with the lowest incomes. And the National Housing Strategy must urgently adjust course to prioritize non-market housing. This is housing that charges rents based on break-even operating costs and future replacement reserve contributions. So non-market housing, if it's done right, will meet the definition of adequate housing in perpetuity. And the right to housing means that everyone should have access to adequate housing that meets their needs without discrimination. And the human right to adequate housing is defined in international law and is now enshrined in Canada's domestic law in the 2019 National Housing Strategy Act. And under international human rights law, there are 7 criteria that define adequate housing, including affordability, accessibility, habitability, where there's enough space for those who live there and is in good repair, security of tenure to protect from eviction, forced relocation, or harassment, access to basic services, including safe drinking water, must be in a safe location that is free from danger and pollution, and it must be culturally adequate. Everyone has a human right to a home that meets all of these criteria, and a human rights-based approach puts people first. It prioritizes people and the adequate housing that they need, and this is the way forward on housing policy. A human rights-based approach to housing requires that governments mobilize all available resources to help people facing the most disadvantage first, so that everyone can enjoy the right to housing in the shortest possible time. And it also requires that there is meaningful engagement by people with lived experience in the decision-making processes. So I'm calling on governments to make a rights-based approach to their housing supply targets, because we need the right kind of supply for those who need housing the most. So today's panel of non-market housing experts are here to discuss the details on how to properly direct government investment and policy while building on the lessons learned from the past, both the good and the bad. And the panelists will speak to the need to acquire and build more non-market housing, and also what legislative changes can allow non-market actors to unlock more capital on their own to acquire and build more. And we must counter the narrative that only the private market has the ability and the capital, and that they must be incentivized to build the housing that we need. And we've been hearing that narrative for the past 30 years, and so far, no significant supply has been created. But if there is something we did learn over the past 30 years, is that wealth doesn't trickle down. Government investments to the wealthy do not trickle down to the rest of us, and it does not result in housing as a community good. So today our panelists will outline ways that the federal government can take on a leadership role in creating appropriate supports for the non-market sector to build capacity to ensure their success. I do offer 3 cautionary notes and points of consideration before we begin. One is the assumption that non-market housing will take care of disadvantaged groups while the market takes care of everyone else. We need a cultural change towards a choice-based, equitable, and sustainable housing environment so that non-market housing is a choice for everyone. A high concentration of low-income people can pose challenges to the economic stability of non-market housing sector and lead to increasing spatial concentration of poverty and disadvantage. The second caution is that just because a housing provider is non-market, there still needs to be overall protections in place for all forms of rental housing to support tenants' right to security of tenure. No housing provider is infallible, and it's important to state that all must uphold the human right to adequate housing. And third, we must be careful not to make assumptions based on colonial forms of knowing that aren't consistent with the inherent rights of Indigenous people to self-determined housing, rights to the land, and other rights consistent with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. So before we move to our guest speaker, I will note that the advice provided today and the comments and resources listeners offer in the chat will be synthesized and complemented with our research, our extensive engagement work, and existing recommendations as part of our National Right to Housing Day advocacy efforts. And this includes calls to government duty bearers to act on their human rights commitments and stated commitments to invest in non-market housing in Canada. Thank you so much for your time, and back to Alex to introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you so much, Marie-Josée, for setting that context and for grounding us in actions and solutions. I'm really struck by a few thoughts that you shared, including how do we ensure that we are set up for success and that we uphold people's ability to choose where they live and that we aren't reproducing a violent colonial system. Public policy that includes human rights measures is limited. And then when we're talking about community value, it's important that leaders get it right. These are such powerful messages to open our day. And so thank you so much. I would now like to introduce Dr. Witzman, who was asked by the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate to develop a rights-based calculation of housing need across Canada, and who will be speaking to some of that work today. And introducing the concept of rights-based supply and some additional context that I think is going to help drive our thinking even further. So welcome, Dr. Witzman.
Thank you, Alex. So as Alex said, what I'm going to be talking about today is sort of setting a framework for the panelists when they talk about policy. The Office of the Federal Housing Advocate exists to monitor progress towards the progressive realization of the right to adequate housing and to address systemic barriers. And in order to do so, we need a baseline of where we're at. So the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate asked me to develop a rights-based calculation of housing need across Canada. This was in response to a report published last year by the CMHC that estimated a need for 5.8 million homes to be built across Canada by 2030. The CMHC calculation is based on a methodology called the median multiple, which divides the cost of an average home by the income of an average household. And internationally, the ratio for affordability has been a house should be 3 times the cost of your income. So a middle class household should be buying a house that is 3 times their combined pre-tax income. So, as you may have guessed, this methodology focuses on middle income affordability, which is definitely an issue in Canada. But that way of calculating housing need isn't compliant with 80 years of CMHC reports since its creation in the 1940s. And it is not compliant with the National Housing Strategy Act. Instead, income-based categories have been used, usually focusing on the affordability of low-income households and moderate-income households. A rights-based approach starts with the question, who needs what housing where and at what cost? And that's been true since a report called the Curtis Report in 1944 that said that calculated Canada's housing need and said that 1/3 of new housing production should be public housing, not-for-profit housing. Another 1/3 of new housing production should be rent regulated by rent control. There was rent control in the 1940s in Canada. And a third should be market-based ownership housing. The most commonly used way to measure housing need in Canada, it's called core housing need, and it's been calculated in the census every 5 years since 1991. Core housing need asks 2 questions. The first is your household living in housing that costs more than 30% of your pre-tax household income? And or are you overcrowded in that house? And or does the house need major repairs? But there's a second question, which is, can you afford an adequate home within your local area? So that calculation of core housing need excludes wealthy households who might be spending more than 30% of their income, but they could find a cheaper, adequate option. The advantages of core housing need is that it's easy to calculate because it is in the census. It is replicable over time, so it's been calculated every 5 years from 1991. You can compare jurisdictions, and it's based on actual evidence. So it's good in a number of ways, and I'm going to drop the link to our project, the Housing Assessment Resource Tools project, that has looked at core housing need divided by income category and the maximum housing costs that people can use, by household size and by priority population. And that kinds of calculations actually should be done by the federal government. What we found, and it's not surprising to anyone who works in housing, is that almost 80%, almost 4 in 5 of households that are in core housing need are low income. And across the country, they can afford to spend no more than $1,050 a month for an affordable home. That's 1.1 million households of the 1.45 million households in core housing need. 80% who are low income, and most of the rest are moderate income households. Of the 1.1 million households in core housing need, 300,000 of them are in a category that we have unfortunately had to add, called very low income. And those are people who are reliant on welfare. And across Canada, they can afford to spend a maximum of $420 a month in housing costs. There are a lot of problems with core housing need. It excludes a number of groups. One of those groups is 2.2 million adult students who aren't included in the census for a technical reason. The census is taken in May, and they may be living with their parents again, as opposed to living independently. But if you go to the Statistics Canada website, they don't include students because being an adult student is considered a temporary and voluntary position of poverty. We don't include homeless people in core housing need because you need a private home in order to be calculated whether you're paying enough. So the measurements of homelessness in Canada are not very good. The most recent series of point-in-time counts finds 35,000. Other estimates that are probably underestimates are 235,000 households. But they aren't counted in core housing need. And one of the things that I argue in my paper is that if you aren't counted, you don't count in housing policy. Another group that isn't counted are 700,000 people living in what's called congregate housing, so not a private house. It doesn't have a private entrance. It doesn't have a private bathroom. That's everything from long-term care to rooming houses, to institutions, to group homes, or even living in a basement without a private entrance. And many of those people live in unaffordable and in otherwise inadequate housing. It also doesn't include temporary farm workers because farms don't count as private residences, but we know the condition of temporary farm workers, particularly migrant farm workers, is inadequate. It also doesn't include what we call suppressed household formation. So an intergenerational household, adults living with their parents, or a roommate, two people living together, not because they love one another and want to live together, and that goes beyond whether you're in a sexual relationship or not, but simply because of affordability. Those are the fastest growing households in Canada, intergenerational households and roommate households, and that's largely because of affordability. Core housing need also doesn't include what we call suppressed household demand, which means you're driving until you qualify for an affordable place, and that may leave you with more than an hour commute to where you work or to services or to where you need to be for school and other reasons. So when you add up those groups, the groups that are counted in housing need, my report for the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate estimates 3 million households, most of them single-person households, who can afford no more than $1,050 a month rent. That's a deficit. That doesn't count population growth. A further 1.3 million households, generally 2 or more people, are moderate income and can't afford more than $1,700 a month in housing costs, or they're middle income households and they are in an unaffordable situation, even though they can afford to spend up to $2,500 in monthly costs. Based on current immigration trends, I calculate the need, including growing population and existing deficit, as 9.6 million households. Now, that doesn't mean we need to build 9.6 million homes over the next decade. We can acquire homes to keep them affordable. We can subdivide homes. We can give ongoing subsidies as we do, but there is a huge unmet growing need for deeply affordable housing, and we need to find the policy settings that can meet the kinds of affordable rents, it's not homeownership, that people can afford to pay. The report ends with recommendations to make sure that the uncounted count in housing policy. So needs assessments need to focus on the entire population, including homeless people, students, migrant farm workers, those who live in congregate housing, those who are in involuntary sharing situations. They have to work backwards from a sense of what these groups can afford. To state the obvious, no one moves from an encampment or a shelter into a suburban subdivision. That doesn't happen. All federal reports and programs have to use consistent definitions of affordable housing that take into account income categories such as low and moderate income and maximum affordable monthly costs, as well as household size and the needs of priority populations such as Indigenous people who are so overrepresented amongst homeless people, and the needs of people with disabilities who may need ongoing supports as well as a place to live. Accurate needs assessments need to be followed up with programs that meet the needs of the people who currently don't count. Most of the current housing deficit consists of low-income individuals and small households, but not all. Supply programs have to start from that point, rather than the perspective that there's some magical aggregate number of generic homes within a system whose basics have been neglected by the federal government for more than 3 decades. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing solutions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Witzman, for that thought-provoking analysis. I am absolutely going to quote you saying, if you aren't counted, you don't count in public policy. This really speaks to the invisibility of some people's experiences in the current housing regime, which cannot meet their needs. I find myself reflecting on how this discussion today is deeply relevant in the context of yesterday's fall economic statement, which I mentioned earlier, as did Marie-Josée, where a lot of the investments are more of the same. There's an emphasis on private market with only a few wins for rights-based housing. And even worse than more of the same, it also puts more pressure on consumers. We need a plan and a pathway that invests in the people and communities who need it most, the people who currently don't count, as you said, Carolyn. Thank you. We will now turn to our panelists, Stéphane Corriveau, followed by Margaret Faux and Olga Tasky, who will present consecutively, followed by some questions and answers facilitated by the advocate, Marie-Josée Houle. Stéphane, I welcome you to start us off, and then our wonderful tech team will unpin you and then directly pin the next speaker. I'm so excited for your presentations, and welcome. Thank you.
Alors, merci beaucoup, Alex. Merci à Marie-Josée et à toute l'équipe pour m'inviter ici aujourd'hui. I'd like to say that I too was impressed by Carolyn's report, and that having new numbers are significantly useful in our argument and the way we envisage how it's possible to tackle the issue. At this point, I still have to say, well, it just makes the challenge bigger. But we already, with the previous number, we thought we had a big job to do. So now the job is even bigger. So that calls for a major approach that are changing the way we deal with things. I'm not going to repeat our number and how we got there. But one element that I'd like to underline at this point is that we use quite often the expression non-market housing, and I rather go to the expression non-speculative housing. And the difference between both of them is the fact that not-for-profit land trusts and so on are market project, because we do rent the apartment. It's not free housing. It's affordable housing, which is a different concept. And we manage it so people, every time someone is paying a rent, they're buying something in return for a service. So there is a market there. And it would be possible to imagine, and it exists in many places in the world, that you have a market that is regulated, controlled, including with consideration that prevents speculative activity. And this is why the cost of the apartment that I was living in when I was 18 years old, that apartment today, without any significant investment in capital, no major repair, no major transformation, that apartment is today over 20 times more expensive than what it was when I was living there. So there's no economic justification, but the fact that there's been speculation there. So there's stopping speculation in the process of slowing it significantly would have a major impact on that total housing stock. So that's the first thing I'd like to say. The second one is that regardless of the fact that something is called the National Housing Strategy, it is not the real title of the National Housing Strategy. The real title of the National Housing Strategy should be, it's the National Housing Strategy for the poor people, which they are numerous, but they don't make the total thing. And if one is to look to the commitment of the federal government and the provincial government, and quite often with the municipal governments across this country, is that there is more support provided for private ownership and through different programs that are not listed in the National Housing Strategy. We're talking about the exemption tax on capital gain on your main residence. We're talking CMHC main program, which is the mortgage insurance program. We're talking all kind of different measures to support, for example, a couple of years ago, who remember that the federal government chipped in $900 million to share equity program. And there's all kind of significant, and for example, the latest cut on the GST has an impact mainly for the higher the rent, the higher the tax break it is, and it's not targeted to lower rent buildings. So we have a national housing strategy that is not saying its name, but is the real money from the federal and provincial government and other entities are being dedicated to private ownership or high-end rental units. So we need to have a reflection on that. And the best way to do that is to understand that if the governments are able to commit for a real thing, they need to commit something that is to a different vision and understanding of the total housing market, not only focusing on what we do as not-for-profit and co-op and land trust. That's the first thing. The second thing is that there is something that us as a sector needs to express in a much more strong way, that we can do a difference because we already own a lot of things. It's not as much as it should be, but as a sector, we own 650,000 units, as it's been said a little bit earlier today. And that means that we have on an approximate calculation about $65 billion worth of assets that is under our control. Now that's $650 billion of assets. That is a significant way to do something that is already in the system, that is already being owned and managed in theory, at least as a not-for-profit sector, public co-op not-for-profit. But these assets are being bound by regulation that do not bound the private for-profit. So for example, accessing most of these assets is being prevented by the government when they sign operating agreement and they say, we're going to give you a grant, we're going to maybe help some of your tenants to pay the rent, but the real material value, the real capital that is invested in your project, which is bricks and mortar and the land, you cannot touch it for at least 30 years and sometimes now 50 years. So that is really hampering our capacity to leverage what we have. So as a sector, we must make ourselves much more vocal about the fact that there's a tool there that is viable, that is the result of significant public investment that we can use. There's another tool that we can think of in a very significant way. In Canada today, there's a massive part of the land that is public or community owned. And when I say massive, well, I'm saying 91% of all the land in Canada. So that's a lot of land that is actually still in the public domain. And even it's not only less densely populated territory in Canada, it is also urban space. So cities in Canada have 65% of their land base are actually publicly owned. Well, of course, there's the street, the sidewalk, there is the schools, there is the park, there is the and so on that belong to the community, and that's 65% of the land. So it means that even in the most dense urban settlement, we collectively can we have the capacity to make a difference, and that should be expressed in a different way than what it is today. I was very happy to hear about now 2 weeks ago when the federal government said, we're going to change the land transfer requirement and we're going to put in a consideration that is not just what they call fair market value, which we could argue was a definition of a fair market. But the point is that they said now 20% of the transfer land need to be dedicated to affordable housing. So I'm still looking to see what's their definition of affordability in that case. So we'll see that there. But the interesting thing is, regardless of what they write as a definition of affordability, they are accepting a different narrative that what we have been told for the last 50 years or so. The price of the land is the price of the land, and the Canadian government cannot manage the land otherwise than if it was managing it for only a for-profit management type of thing. Now they've made the demonstration by themselves that the line can be moved. They move it to 20%, but this is only after that. No, there's no actual scientific reason to say 20%. Could have been 15, could have been 25, and I argue could have been 100%. So that would be, a decision that is already being taken, and the demonstration that it's possible to do it has been done by the federal government itself 2 weeks ago. The other thing is, if we go towards a system where all the land that is available one way or another is being systemically transferred to land trust, would it be public land trust, would it be a community land trust, we give ourselves, by doing that, the capacity to generate something, not to limit the use. On the contrary, this would be a way to maximize the use of the resources that are available there. We would be able to provide incentive to build unit based on the simple fact that if we don't have to pay a large capital investment on the land when you start a project, you are only paying a rent on that piece of land, and that rent should be aligned to the life cycle expected of the building that you're building. So today we are living in a society where 20% of the GDP is actually concentrated into, if you read the GDP number, it is the real estate activity. And the overwhelming value of that 20% is actually money that is being spent in speculative activity, which is not someone that is building a house or multi-unit. It is someone who is buying something that already exists with the sole ambition to resell it later at a higher price. And the way to increase the value of your building today is to increase the level of the rent. So you buy it with a clear expectation to raise the rent, to resell it later to someone who will have, again, the same expectation to raise the rent higher. So one must be very careful in making a difference between someone or some entity that is investing and developing, creating wealth by creating new buildings, versus someone that is buying an existing thing that is not creating any wealth. This is actually concentrating the wealth in the hands of the fewer and fewer and fewer people, because only few people can now afford, and that will keep going. So all of that to come back to the thing that we have in this country, one of the richest country in the world, by any way you can calculate it, the total value of the land, the total value of the economic output, the total value of whatever the indicator. But we manage to impoverish ourselves by not leveraging that into proper investment. And housing is a key investment to make it efficient, to make it a good way to use the money, will allow for better living condition for people, and will allow for the capacity to build infrastructure that are sorely lacking today. Non-polluant, sorry, word is missing me, but the way of transport that will not generate pollution, organizing the land in a way that is the most efficient, putting the infrastructure. Now today, when we think we're going to put an infrastructure somewhere, one of the first costs, and it's always a booming cost, is, oh, we're going to have to buy back a huge piece of land to do that. Well, we shouldn't have to buy it back. That land should be developed according to the need of the general population and what's the best use of it. So all of that to say that there is a lot of possibility for investment, including by individual people. For example, we have in Canada, at least, there's a number of funds that are benefiting from a special fiscal consideration because it matched some objective. For example, there's many jurisdictions where they have fiscal advantage if you invest in the field of making movies. There's a lot of place movie credit, and there's tons of different programs for something that is being seen as advantageous. The one thing that we don't have is a program that, and these programs have a perennial view, and there's predictability and reproducibility being able to put it there, including in the housing sector. Again, the tax capital exemption, CMHC allows you, through their mortgage insurance program, allows a private investor to have a long-term predictability and get into planning and investment. What we have with the not-for-profit community housing speculative out of speculation market is something that is only on little touch here and there, making it impossible for any of us to do something significant. Yesterday announcement, we can challenge the capacity of the government to go much further than what they went. But the point is that it's again another drop that is for a couple of months, and then no one knows what's going to happen after a couple of months. We cannot develop housing in this country with a policy, certainly not for profit housing, with a policy that is telling us, in 6 months, who knows what will be the rule. Co-investment has been viable for the last 4 years, and there's need at least 5 iterations of that. So not even a full year for having what is being introduced as the flagship program of CMHC for years. Same thing for our CFI, same thing for all the different programs. So we need to have a program, not a program, but a policy that is long lasting, introduce affordability through tax credits, for example, and other subsidies, and that is welcoming for individual investment that are willing to do. I know plenty of middle-class people who would be happy to have their RRSP being invested, for example, into affordable housing, and happy to have a rate of return that is not 20%. We would be happy to have something that would be 4.5%, 5%, more or less the price that the bank would be charging us for rent, for making a loan to us. But why can't we have those kind of tools? We have that in many other fields. So having those investment, making it possible to have predictability, and not only predictability, but also simplification. Again, I'm going to end with that, saying that, if you think of it, when we try to ask to have funding to build something, before you can start doing the building, you got to have approval for, I don't know how many dozens of civil servants and how many level of government saying yes, and it meets not only our requirement, but our fiscal capacity. We have that much money at the beginning of the year, and your proposal can be a perfect proposal, but you're coming in too late. You're coming in October, and the money is gone. So your proposal, whatever good it is, you're not going to get support. Well, you can sell your house on December 31st at 11 o'clock at night, 59 minutes, and you're still going to get the tax credit for your house being sold. Nobody's going to challenge that. So we need programs that are simply saying, if you meet the requirement, you will be receiving the support. Would it be a tax credit? Would it be a subsidy? So it's not a challenge about, is there enough money? We need to have something that says, if you meet X, Y, Z requirement, you will be supported. And that's the way to go forward.
Stéphane, thank you so much. We're quite well over time, but I look forward to asking you questions. We'll move on to our next speaker. Thanks so much.
I'm sorry for speaking for too long. Thank you for hearing.
Toyaksitnin, thank you for that, Stéphane, and Toyaksitnin, Marie-Josée, for hosting this panel. Toyaksiem, thank you all for being here. I'm only going to speak to 3 points because I know we're behind, and I'm going to pick up on the land comments that Stéphane was talking to, and I'll keep it succinct. There's 2 words: land back. When we were in conference this week, we had Michelle Good, who wrote the book called 10 Little Indians, or 5 Little Indians. My mom used to sing me a song called 10 Little Indians, but she also wrote a book, Truth Telling, and she spoke about the issue of the 90+% of the land that's still available is being Crown land. And when we look at the impact of colonization across this country, what does Crown land mean? So in our terms as Indigenous, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples of this country, land back would be the first thing I would lead to when we think about what's available in this country. And that means that you have to have First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and urban Indigenous leaders at the table when you're starting to develop these policies, practices, and programs. I also want to say to Carolyn, for your amazing report. For those of us that have been in this sector, we talked about it. Our elder that opened up our conference, Shane Point, said that he's been doing this work for 20 years, so he considers himself 20 years old. I had to confess that as of April 4th, I will be in this industry for 30 years, which kind of makes me Shane Point's elder, which I found kind of funny. But those of us that have been in the sector, you just encapsulated, Carolyn, the reality that we've all been living and fighting, especially when we look at the most marginalized and impoverished communities out there, from, our people that are living with disabilities, our 2S LGBTQ plus communities, our gender-based violence issues, and our Indigenous issues. When we see governments fail to recognize the depth of the crisis that we're really in and pick the low-hanging fruits, and I'll speak more about that later during the Q&A, what we end up with is performative decision-making and not really true human rights, justice-based decision-making. And so I just want to say, thank you so much for what you shared, Carolyn. And then the last thing I'm just going to speak to, and thank you, Stefan, for raising it, this whole concept of GDP in Canada. When I take a look at the reports that we're seeing, what we know is that Canada is falling behind their peer countries when we look at GDP. And we have also, due to decades of neglect from all levels of government into the housing ecosystem, are falling behind on the housing front. Is that a coincidence? It's awfully, awfully coincidental that we are seeing those parallels in this country falling behind on key metrics. So I'm looking forward to Monday. I saw in the chat somebody had asked the name of the report that's going to be released. I look forward to it being released on Monday. It's called The Impact of Community Housing on Productivity, to help maybe set the stage for some new policy making. So Toyaksim, thanks everyone.
Hi, I'm going to jump in and just harken back a bit to the early 1990s when the co-op housing programs or community housing programs federal programs were canceled. And at that time we had, as I think the number was already alluded to, about 650,000 units. And that includes public housing, cooperatives, and nonprofit. And meanwhile, our population in Canada has grown by close to 10 million. Since then, other government and private sector initiatives like RCFI have added a marginal number of affordable units to the rental market. For the most part, though, government have assumed that somehow the private market can deliver what's needed, sometimes with incentives such as density bonusing in exchange for an affordability carve-out. But we can't expect the private market to solve the affordability problem. The fact is, developers aren't philanthropists any more than market economic actors are in other sectors. They are in business to make money, whereas non-market housing delivered by community housing providers operate on a non-profit basis and sets the rents to break even. That is housing offered at cost with access to rent geared to income subsidies. So singles and families who can't even afford those break-even rents get a helping hand and are blended into communities that are truly mixed income. What do we mean by non-market or community housing? We've talked about that a bit already. So we're talking about mixed income, community-owned and operated, not-for-profit housing. It includes cooperatives that are resident-owned and operated, and nonprofit housing, which is community-owned and operated, and sometimes includes support services. Developed under a variety of programs since the 70s, the housing isn't part of the speculative market, as Stefan alluded to, and is an investment that exists in perpetuity. In fact, we can see the evidence of the lasting effect of past investments. Last year, the Co-op Housing Federation of Canada commissioned a study that drew on data from the agency And researchers compared rents in housing co-ops in Victoria, Vancouver, Edmonton, Toronto, and Ottawa with comparable private sector market rentals over a 16-year period. Not surprisingly, the study found that co-op rents were on average 70% of market, dropping somewhat over time, with variances between cities and built form, that is, apartments versus townhouses. So 20 to 30 years later, co-op members are paying break-even rents, not rent geared to their income, that are hundreds of dollars less, as much as $500 per month or $6,000 per year, than their local rental market. That means more money left in their take-home pay to cover the other necessities of life. So let's be clear, we're talking about well-maintained housing where capital repairs are ongoing. Indeed, with guidance and support from the agency and their sector organizations, housing co-ops built in the 70s through the 90s are thriving communities of affordable housing. Virtually all of those eligible offer rent geared to income through the National Housing Strategy's Federal Community Housing Initiative. This allows them to provide financial support for their most vulnerable low-income members. But this assistance isn't permanent. It's currently set to end in 2028. And while that seems like an eternity away, housing co-ops are starting to be careful about offering housing to the people who need it the most because they can't afford to commit to subsidizing them indefinitely. And we've been there before. The assistance is there, but groups are cautious about depending on it too much because they're the ones who would be stuck telling their most vulnerable members that their rental assistance will be ending. So today, housing co-ops created through the legacy federal programs have paid off their mortgages, thus terminating their operating agreements with CMHC. And it's interesting to note that today, close to half of those co-ops that reached the end of their operating agreements are now completely mortgage-free and are focused on renewing their properties and drawing on the reserves that they built up over the years. Some are investing in energy efficiency by replacing windows and doors, and heat pumps and solar panels, and others are adding more units. And we're seeing many examples of these across the country. And land trusts are also playing a big role, such as the land trust associated with the Co-op Housing Federation of BC, which has been active in developing projects on lands leased from the City of Vancouver and densification projects. And similarly, the Co-op Housing Federation of Toronto is working closely with the City of Toronto on developing more co-ops. And these are fantastic initiatives, but the scale is really insufficient to meet the vast need. Many are anxiously awaiting the launch of the Co-op Housing Development Program that was announced in the budget, the 2022 federal budget. Again, had the 6,000 units committed under this program, and with a bit more money added in yesterday's announcements, are fabulous, but they're not accompanied by rent geared to income to house families and single people in the lowest income quintile. So what we need is much, much more community housing of all sorts to fill the kinds of gaps that Carolyn's research is alluding to. To build scale, we need non-market housing programs with support from all levels of government. So I'll end here, and I'll say that just because I have a lot more to say, but I know we're running short on time. And I think that the answers to the questions will likely get into a bit more of the detail.
Great. Thank you so much for everyone. I'm going to dive on into some questions because I know we're running short on time. But according to Carolyn, Canada needs to create a minimum of 20% non-market housing, up from the current 3.5%. And we need to hold the federal, provincial, and territorial governments to account for their commitment to growing the community housing sector as part of the National Housing Strategy and as agreed in the 2018 Housing Partnership Framework. So prior to 2017, the federal government did not invest in community housing for decades, and we now have the National Housing Strategy, and we need a vision beyond 2028 and investments in perpetuity. Non-market housing offers a really important opportunity for the progressive realization of the human right to housing, including housing that is affordable, accessible, and culturally appropriate, for example. So I'd like to explore some questions with you about what opportunities are under the National Housing Strategy to mobilize non-market housing within the framework of the human right to adequate housing and the need for systemic change. So I'm going to start with you, Olga and Stefan, and then Margaret. What are some policy and legislative changes that can help unlock land or assets and protect the existing affordable housing stock with the purpose of creating more housing for everyone in our communities? I know some of you have already spoken to this in their opening remarks, and I guess this is just an opportunity to expand a little bit more. So we'll start with Olga.
Well, I think that, you know, our experience with the National Housing Strategy is that the co-investment fund has really been inaccessible to housing co-ops. So I think we need to look at change to make that a lot simpler and a lot more accessible. I know that the co-op housing development program is looking at drawing on the equity of housing co-ops to supplement the capital available. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about that. But I really see that, as folks from CHRA will say, we need a Team Canada approach where governments are collaborating amongst themselves and collaborating with the sector for co-design on programs that can be delivered on a much larger scale. There's also one thing that I've heard recently is that the seed funding that CMHC had previously available for pre-development costs has run out, and that is, of course, an important element to getting the ball rolling on being able to plan and prepare for new development. And as I mentioned earlier, I think that continued rental assistance for providers to house and assist the lower income households is essential in order to really fill that gap for those who can't afford the rental market rents or the break-even rents in community housing.
Great, thank you, Stefan.
As you said, I've addressed some of that, so I won't be speaking on long term there. But clearly, the federal government, I mean, the first thing they should do today, right now, is to say no more land transfer, just to take back the expression of Margaret. So land back would be the first thing they can do, because this is at no cost. So they can do that today easily. The second one is we really need to have capacity entrenched in a systemic way, not into program, but literally something that is permanent, that is predictable, to have access to capital for us to grow the sector. I mean, it's not magic, but I mean, workers that are coming to build the houses need to be paid. we need to buy the 2x4. We need to buy whatever we need to build houses and acquire it. So if we don't have access to that money, everything else is moot argument, because nothing will happen. And we need to make sure that there's also means to support the tenants who have an issue sometime, and I would argue most time, they don't have a housing issue. What they have is a financial capacity issue. They can't afford to pay the rent of their unit. So now the rent is being loaded by speculation. But even if we buy today 5 million housing, the actual cost of building a unit in Canada, even if it's small and as small unit as possible, we're talking to about $300,000 per unit. So $300,000 needs to be paid to someone. Workers will need that money. The 2x4, no, Home Depot will ask for money for the 2x4 and so on. So we need to be able to rent those units at the cost it actually costs to build them. But then in order to provide those units, we need to have people who can afford to pay those. And that require significant change in wealth redistribution policy in this country. Raise minimum wage, increase housing allowance, do those kind of things, plus a significant rent supplement program, call it Canadian Housing Benefit or whatever the name. We can have the detail about that, but they must be a stream to support tenants that are living in not-for-profit co-op and other non-speculative housing units to be able to afford the rent that us to build and own and manage those units.
So basically, in other words, just building more doesn't suddenly mean all the rents are going to decrease.
No, it's, I mean, we need more because there's more people, but the fact that we build is not going to lower the price. I mean, for example, for the last several years, it's changed in the last year or so, but Saskatoon had a 7% rate of vacancy for years, and the rent didn't went down. The rent kept going up, not as fast as other regions of the country, but even with 7% rate of vacancy, rent didn't went down. So because people who own the building said, no, I'd rather wait to rent it at a higher price than lower the value of my building by renting it at a lower price. So it's not just having more houses, it's to have an intervention that will regulate the market in a significant way. And that could be by laws, but it also can be through fiscal and government investment that are challenging the way things are being managed today. The market is basically being said, no, go wild, and we applaud. No, we have many markets in Canada that are being managed and controlled and regulated. Communication, part of the food supply, so we can have policy of that nature as well in housing, and that would make it possible to do a different game than the game we're playing today.
Great, thank you. Margaret, what are you seeing
Yeah.
as opportunities in national housing strategy?
Yeah, I think I have three that I'll speak to, and two are in and one is not, but should be within the national housing strategy. And I'll echo what Stefan had said earlier. I think it's a bit of a stretch even to call it a genuine national housing strategy because of the gaps that have been overlooked for decades. But one of the biggest things that I started with when we heard the national housing strategy coming out in the co-investment fund, although you were absolutely correct. I mean, it's a difficult to access, hard to produce the tangible outcomes and targets that our communities so desperately need. But I remember when the Rapid Housing Initiative was announced, the first round, and I phoned Evan Siddell and I said to him, because I recognize here in British Columbia that, and it's probably the same across the country, there's a large inequity between the haves and the have-nots in the housing ecosystem. You have the larger, more economically flush, I mean, used to be, they're all hitting crisis points now too. But you get the bigger, more savvy organizations that are able to tap into all of these funding streams with ease, and they're chronically being accepted because government sees them as successful. So they just default to the status quo of those that have demonstrated success. But the problem is those that are smaller or those that have less capacity because they only have one or two staff members, they don't have enough economic plushness in their budgets to hire the architects or to hire the housing expert to write the proposals. Some of those proposals are so lengthy. I mean, I think I heard even a municipality complaining that it was like a 200+ page application to access some of the federal funding streams. Who has the time and the expertise to really chronically meet all of those expectations to apply to the funds? But I reached out to Evan Siddell and I said, here in BC, I know that I have a number of smaller urban rural communities, Indigenous housing providers that are desperate to get some of these funds. Can you just treat AMA like a municipality? So like you treat Vancouver, like you treat Toronto, or some of those bigger metro regions. Can you treat AMA like a municipality so that we, knowing our providers, can make meaningful allocations to our communities that would otherwise never have the time or the capacity to actually tap into those funds? So we're very, very close to actually signing an agreement with the federal government to do not under the Rapid Housing Initiative, but under the co-investment fund. And yes, it's taken us a long time to get here, but we're on the brink of actually signing an agreement to roll some dollars out to our communities and ideally tap into those that are urgent and unmet needs because they can't tap into these national housing strategy funding streams. What's not in the strategy that we've been calling for a long time, but we've had some success with here in British Columbia, is the Rental Protection Fund. We came together as a sector actually in 2019 to lobby the BC government to invest in purpose-built affordable rentals because of what we saw happen in the market, in the real estate market, in the rental market. where people that were living in what used to be purpose-built affordable rentals were being rent evicted, speculative buyers, foreign investments. We've seen many purpose-built rentals be acquired and then sit empty from foreign investors, waiting for some other, initiative to come to ground. In the meantime, all of those people are adding to our homelessness crisis, and they're elevating the increase in the market. And so we lobbied BC in 2019 saying that the sector has the expertise, and we've demonstrated it, 30 to 50 years of expertise, the sector capacity to actually acquire and retain the affordability of those purpose-built rentals, because it's been happening in piecemeal over the decades here in British Columbia, and I'm sure it's been happening across the country. So the province of BC last year made the commitment to invest $500 million in the Rental Protection Fund for the sector-led, and that's CHF BC, so Co-op Housing Federation BC, BC Not-for-Profit Housing, and AMA, essentially Housing Central. And so we've received those first funds in a first tranche. We're aiming to get all the dollars out, because as you heard at the conference this week, we've had huge success. And I'm just posting in the link a City TV News article that summarized the presentation that was given by our CEO, Katie, that we're already nearly 60% subscribed in less than 6 months from starting this initiative. So it's a scalable project that could and ought to be filling a big gap in the national housing strategy, and that's the preservation of currently existing rental protection funds. And that's also a human rights-based approach too, because we know that rent evicting people just to turn a profit is not a human rights-based approach. And so sector-led entities that are all on this call today are the people that can actually preserve those affordability and protect the rights of those people that are already in purpose-built rental. And then the only third thing I'll reference that is also in the National Housing Strategy that is working after much advocacy from across this country, including CHTC, and including the agency and many other allies across the country, is an investment in urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing. And in particular, we are in agreement with housing or with infrastructure for the $281.5 million to be delivered through the new National Indigenous Collaborative Housing Inc. Their website is www.nichi.ca, and they're going to be putting a call for proposals out that will be much more accessible to providers across the country for urgent and unmet urban Indigenous needs. And again, it's about recognizing that many of the processes within the National Housing Strategy have actually been barriers to access those funds. And so NICHI is seeking an innovative way to open the door for communities that perhaps have been often overlooked, and in particular the northern regions, Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Inuit. So we're very excited about those 3 initiatives that I think can speak a lot to helping the National Housing Strategy become more wholesome.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margaret.
Hi
We're
there,
down to the
Margaret.
wire.
Sorry,
So
this is on the interpreter. If you wouldn't mind doing the website again, I just missed that before, and I want to include that in interpretation. Thank you.
okay, great. Thank you. And so one last question, because we're down to the last couple minutes, maybe a minute each or so. What are some past approaches that work well, and what lessons did we learn that shouldn't be repeated moving forward? We'll start with Stefan.
Well, past lesson that worked well, we can say that, between 1950 and 1990, we did grow the not-for-profit out of speculation realm by a significant, we start basically at 0 and we were reaching almost 10%. So now in 30 years, we've lost a large part of that, not so much that we've lost unit, but because we didn't cope with the growth of the whole thing. So the inspiration is that we've done it, and many other OECD countries with similar legal and financial system have a much higher rate than we have. So that's the proof that it's possible. So that's a lesson learned, and that's also the thing we can do, that we can inspire ourselves, and we know it's possible to do it, and we know it's actually beneficial not only for the individual who live in those units, but for the whole community. And this is the way to take Canada out of the inflation crisis. This is a way to take Canada out of several of the social crises that we are having, is to make sure people have basic housing available for them, that will improve the capacity of the workforce, that will improve the well-being of people, that will reduce health costs, and so on. So making housing a significant part of the agenda in a way that does not boost the speculative market, as it is done most of the case today, is the way to go. So we know what to do and we know how to do it. So now let's pull down the glove and work on how to fix it really.
Great, thank you. Margaret?
Well, I mean, I think it's been clear that, you know, the fact that the entire sector across Canada had to use their voice in a united way to pressure the government, because the first national housing strategy that was released completely ignored Indigenous rights, full stop, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and the urban Indigenous. You know, I think it's evidence that we do have a powerful role to play, especially as a united voice. And I think that, you know, now that we're seeing the failure in the economic statement to acknowledge the true depth of our housing and homelessness crisis, I think it's incumbent upon us as a sector to add that united voice to pressure the government to really put some bold and meaningful investment into the national housing strategy for the entire housing ecosystem. And I say housing ecosystem because I think, you know, we've somehow failed to remember that the, you know, wraparound supports and the pathways that the funding to help build pathways out of homelessness and to prevent the fall into homelessness aren't getting funded to the same levels that they used to be funded long ago. And so we need to put the pressure on governments to make sure our budgets are inclusive of that.
Great, thank you. Olga, last words to you, and then I hand it over to Alex.
Three things that I will leave with. One is that mixed income housing works. When needs are so great, I think it's going to be very tempting. It's always very tempting to target programs to those that are most in need, but let's not recreate low-income ghettos. Rental assistance, or RGI, has worked well. I think more of that is valuable, and it's a good investment when you tie that in with in-community housing. And my final word is think long-term. Housing is a long-term investment. The needs of today are not necessarily the needs of tomorrow. Well-intentioned policies can become administrative burdens for years to come and no longer necessarily serve the intended purpose. So think long-term.
Thank you so much. Alex, I'll let you close us off.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to our panelists for this important dialogue, especially Stefan, Margaret, Olga, and Marie-Josée, but also Dr. Witzman and Elder Sequalia for starting us off in such a good way. As we conclude today's National Housing Day event, let's carry with us a renewed and unyielding commitment to housing as a fundamental human right. Our discussions today have highlighted the urgent need for inclusive, rights-based solutions that address the diverse and pressing needs across Canada in housing. I've been very lucky to be part of a campaign that advocates working on social housing as a human right, which brings some of these themes together and builds upon some of the work that was highlighted by our speakers today. Deeply rooted shifts are needed to create community-held, public, and non-market housing. And I would also add, as others highlighted in the chat, to create robust tenant protections to prevent housing loss in the first place. But it is up to us to hold decision makers accountable. Business as usual will not support our survival. I also want to recognize that the solutions we've discussed today are geared mostly towards urban settings, and that we need to resource communities to bring forward and act on their learnings within rural and northern settings, where it costs more to build, resources are more scarce, and there are no economies of scale. And again, it's really important that we touch on tenant protections because that is such an important piece of context on National Housing Day. This moment is not just an end, but a beginning. a call to action for us all to work together, breaking down systemic barriers and building a future where adequate, accessible, and affordable housing is a reality for all. For next steps to build on today's conversation, the National Right to Housing Network, supported by the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate, will publish a summary report on the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate's website in December. The advocate will take this advice and participate in Housing on the Hill on November 28th. This is an advocacy event at Parliament Hill, sponsored by partners at the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association. And then finally, the advocate and her team will continue to promote human rights-based solutions to housing policy in Canada through her engagement with rights holders, her systemic reviews, and her advocacy to government decision makers. Thank you so much to everyone who tuned in today. I've been watching the chat and the Q&A. Your thoughts are so important, and I'm really excited for the ways that we can build something really powerful together. And thank you again to our wonderful speakers. Hope you have a great rest of your day and afternoon.